The night air over Washington, D.C., in the mid-1990s carried a strange stillness, as though the city itself were holding its breath between the distant hum of traffic and the soft echo of sirens drifting through the narrow corridors of rowhouses. It was a city of contradictions, marble monuments standing tall against neighborhoods marked by struggle, ambition rising beside uncertainty. In those quiet hours, long after office lights faded downtown, another story unfolded in the shadows, a story spoken in whispers rather than headlines. Among those whispers was a name that moved like a current through the alleys and corner shops, Malik Stoneheart, Redd. No one remembered the first time they heard it, but everyone remembered the feeling that name carried. It was not fear in the usual sense, nor was it admiration. It was something quieter, something like the hush that settles before a thunderstorm. Stoneheart had earned his place in the city's folklore long before most people saw his face. The legends described him as unshakable, a man who moved with the patience of a chess master and the resolve of someone who had learned early that hesitation could be fatal. His presence was rarely loud, in fact, it was the silence surrounding him that fueled his myth. People said he walked without hurry, spoke only when necessary, and carried a stillness that made even reckless men pause. In a world filled with noise, Malik Redd was an unexpected calm. But before Malik became Stoneheart, before the stories spread across carryout counters and bus stops, he was simply a boy navigating a city that demanded early maturity. The Washington of his youth was a place of shifting borders, unofficial lines drawn not on maps but in lived experience. Some blocks were safe at sunrise yet dangerous by twilight. Some neighborhoods thrived on community pride while others bore scars left by the crack epidemic and economic neglect. Malik saw all of it with observant, cautious eyes. He had a quiet way of studying the world around him, as though collecting pieces of a larger puzzle only he could see. Those who knew him as a child described him as calm, thoughtful, and far older than his years. Even then, there was something about the city that both comforted and challenged him. The rhythm of D.C., the distant rumble of metro trains, the laughter spilling from stoops on summer nights, the solemn watch of monuments under moonlight, became the backdrop of his earliest memories. Yet those same memories included moments of tension, when raised voices or flashing lights interrupted the calm. Malik learned early to listen more than he spoke, to observe patterns, and to understand how quickly peace could shift into uncertainty. These lessons did not come from books but from the streets themselves, which shaped every child who walked them. What set Malik apart was not where he lived, but how deeply he paid attention to what others overlooked. At night, when most children slept without worry, Malik found himself drawn to the window, watching the glow of passing headlights paint shifting patterns on the walls. He wondered about the lives unfolding beyond the glass, people returning home from late shifts, others leaving for reasons unknown. It was during these quiet hours that he began sensing the invisible threads connecting moments, choices, and consequences. He didn't yet know how these threads would one day pull him into places he never intended to go. But the awareness was already forming, a quiet readiness that made him different. The city, in its restless beauty, was shaping him into someone who would walk through danger with steady breath and steady heart. In the streets, people judged strength by loudness, by the ones who boasted or barked commands. But Malik observed something else. The true power belonged to those who held themselves still, the individuals who seemed unmoved by chaos. Perhaps without realizing it, he began to mirror that quality. Older teens would watch him and shrug, unsure how someone so young carried such composure. Neighbors nodded with a kind of quiet respect. Even teachers, though frustrated by his reserved nature, recognized that his silence was not defiance but contemplation. It was as though Malik lived half a step outside the rush of everyday life, watching from a vantage point no one else could see, preparing for a path he had not yet stepped onto. As stories of the city's shifting power circulated, Malik listened from the background. He heard about emerging crews, territorial disputes, and the many choices young men faced when opportunities were scarce and temptations abundant. None of this drew him in directly, yet it shaped his understanding of the environment he navigated. The streets were not merely physical spaces but living ecosystems with rules, rhythms, and consequences. Malik sensed that every block told a story, every figure walking alone at night carried secrets, and every rumor hinted at deeper truths. He absorbed these impressions quietly, storing them like pages in an unwritten book. Without knowing it, he was already becoming part of the very world he observed so carefully. Years later, people would claim they sensed greatness or danger in him even then, but the truth was simpler. Malik Redd grew up learning to listen to the city's quietest signals. This sensitivity, this patient attention, would one day shape the man known as Stoneheart. For now, he remained a boy standing at the threshold of a path that had not yet revealed itself. The nights around him carried secrets, and though he did not seek them, they drifted toward him all the same. He walked past dimly lit storefronts and corner gatherings, blending into the city's rhythm as naturally as breathing. In those early years, Malik did not imagine himself becoming a figure whispered about in cautious tones. He only moved forward, step by steady step, unaware that each moment was gently guiding him toward a future etched into the shadows of Washington, D.C. And the city watched him without revealing its intentions. Malik's early days in Columbia Heights were marked by a quiet understanding of the world around him, a world that moved to its own rhythm, one often dictated by survival rather than aspiration. The streets were a mosaic of bustling life and hidden struggles. By day, the neighborhood hummed with the sounds of children running through the alleyways, elders sitting on stoops discussing everything from the weather to politics, and the soft rattle of shopping carts. But by night, the energy shifted. The air became heavier, charged with an undercurrent of tension. It wasn't the kind of place where you would hear sirens every hour or see violent confrontations at every corner. Instead, it was a city block that had learned to live with its own brand of unspoken tension, the kind that stretched just beneath the surface, waiting for the wrong spark. Malik's family lived in a modest apartment, a small corner unit in a building that seemed as if it had been standing since the dawn of time. The peeling paint on the walls, the creaky floors, and the thin windows didn't provide much comfort against the rough edges of life outside. Yet, inside, there was an unspoken sense of warmth, a place where family mattered, even if the world outside had its own rules. Malik's mother, a single parent, worked long hours at a local diner. She was one of those women who could weather any storm with a smile, never showing how tired she was, never complaining. Her strength was something that Malik absorbed over time, like the steady beat of a drum. She worked hard to keep the family afloat, and though money was tight, there was always enough to eat and enough love to go around. Malik didn't know what it felt like to have a father in the traditional sense. His father had been absent for most of his life, a distant figure in a picture frame, someone Malik had only heard about in passing, mentioned with a mix of resentment and resignation. His mother never spoke of him much, not out of bitterness, but out of practicality. There were no grand tales of the man who'd once been part of their family, just the quiet absence that left Malik to figure out the world on his own. He didn't need a father figure, though. He had the streets to teach him everything he needed to know. The city raised its children in its own image, one of quiet observation and hard lessons. Growing up, Malik wasn't like the other kids on the block. Where they were loud, animated, always trying to prove something, he was different. He observed. He watched. He took in everything, the way people moved, the way they spoke, the way they interacted. He watched his older cousins hustle, run small errands for local dealers, and grow more comfortable with their roles in the neighborhood. But Malik never rushed to join in. He was never eager for attention or validation. He took his time to figure things out. Even as a young boy, it was as if he understood that the right moment to act would come, but it had to be approached with patience. He knew that once you moved into the world of the street, there was no turning back. The choices were permanent. And Malik wasn't yet ready to make those decisions. His life wasn't without its challenges, though. There were moments of confusion and pain, times when he wondered if he'd ever be able to rise above the circumstances he found himself in. His mother's struggle to make ends meet was an invisible weight on their lives. Sometimes, Malik would stay up late at night, lying in bed and listening to the sounds of the neighborhood, thinking about what he could do to make life better. He wasn't sure what his future would look like, but he was certain it couldn't be like the one his mother had. He didn't want to live a life of quiet resignation, even if he didn't yet know what kind of life he did want. In the early days, Malik had the freedom to be a child. He played basketball with the boys from the block, ran down the streets with a carefree laugh, and sometimes snuck into the corner store to buy candy with whatever change he could scrape together. But there were always moments when the carefree energy of youth collided with the reality of the world he lived in. One evening, after a game of pickup basketball, Malik watched as an argument broke out between two older men over a dice game. It wasn't loud at first, just a few harsh words exchanged, but within seconds, everything changed. A shove turned into a punch into a scuffle, and suddenly, the whole block was watching. Malik stood at the edge of the crowd, not moving, just watching as the situation escalated. His heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't feel fear. Instead, he felt something different, an awareness, an understanding of the way people in his world behaved. The scuffle ended quickly when one of the men pulled out a knife, but it wasn't the violence that left a lasting impression on Malik. It was the way it had unfolded so effortlessly, like a dance that everyone knew the steps to. He realized in that moment that the world around him wasn't just a backdrop to his life, it was something that demanded respect. He saw the older men glance at him after the fight broke up, sizing him up, assessing his reaction. Malik didn't flinch, didn't run home, didn't shout for help. He just stood there, watching, calm as ever. It wasn't the bravado of the street, but the calm certainty that would later define him. He understood, even then, that the streets didn't care who you were, only how you moved within them. How you carried yourself. That was when Malik began to realize that he had a choice. He didn't have to become like the others. He didn't have to fall into the patterns that everyone else seemed to follow. But he knew, too, that if he was going to survive, he needed to understand the game. By the time Malik reached his teenage years, he was no longer the quiet boy who watched from the sidelines. He had become something else, something more attuned to the pulse of the streets, to the unspoken rules that governed everything. He had learned to walk the fine line between involvement and detachment, a skill that would serve him well as he ventured deeper into the world that lay just beyond the surface of the life he'd always known. And yet, there was still something that kept him from fully stepping in. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't hesitation, it was something else. It was a deep understanding that everything had its price. The streets would demand something from him, something he couldn't take back. So, Malik kept moving forward, one foot carefully placed in front of the other, knowing that soon, the choice would be made for him. But that was still a few years off. For now, Malik was a boy with the wisdom of a man, quiet, patient, observant, moving through the streets of Columbia Heights, waiting for the moment when the world would ask him to step in. When that moment came, Malik would be ready. The turning point came unexpectedly, as such things often do. Malik had been watching the streets for years, learning their rhythm, their pulse. But until that moment, he had never truly been a part of it, never fully committed to the choices that seemed to pull so many others in. The temptation to take that first step came one evening as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the alleyways of his neighborhood. It wasn't the loud invitation of fast cash or flashy cars, not the bravado of older men puffing out their chests. It was quieter than that. It was a glance, a knowing nod, and a single, simple question that would pull Malik deeper into the world he had only watched from the outside. "Yo, you want to make some real money?" The voice came from Tyrone, a kid a few years older than Malik, someone who had already gained a reputation in their part of the city. Tyrone wasn't someone who screamed for attention, instead, he moved with a kind of quiet confidence that made people listen. He wasn't flashy or loud, but when he spoke, people paid attention. He had already proven himself on the streets, doing everything from running errands for dealers to making moves in the underground world that few understood, even fewer dared to. Malik had watched him from a distance for years, never once thinking that his path would ever intersect with Tyrone's. But there it was, now. The invitation. At first, Malik didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure if Tyrone was serious or just looking for a temporary partner in crime for some short hustle. But the look in his eyes, that mixture of patience and curiosity, told him that this was no small offer. This was a crossroads, the kind of moment that might change everything. For the first time, Malik could feel the pull of the streets, the weight of what it might mean to step in. "What you talking about?" Malik finally asked, his voice calm, almost too calm. Tyrone's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "There's money out here, man. People ain't got it, but they'll pay for it. You look like someone who knows how to stay quiet. You don't talk much, but you don't look scared either. You want to learn how to make it?" Malik paused. His first instinct was to walk away, to turn back to the quiet of his own thoughts, his mother's tired eyes, and the safety of the life he knew. But something held him in place. It wasn't hunger, not exactly. It wasn't the promise of wealth, either. It was the way the question was asked, the way Tyrone made it sound like the most natural thing in the world. This was how it worked, Malik realized. This was the game. The streets didn't need to offer grand speeches or shiny temptations. They simply offered opportunity, cold and simple, as if it was just another part of the city's fabric. "I'll think about it," Malik said, then turned and walked away, his mind already spinning with the possibilities. That night, as he lay in his bed, staring up at the ceiling, Malik couldn't shake the thought. He replayed the conversation over and over again, dissecting the subtle meanings behind every word. Tyrone had been offering him more than just money, he was offering a choice. And that choice wasn't just about the streets, it was about who Malik would become. Could he refuse it? Could he continue watching from the sidelines, living the quiet life his mother had fought for, or would he step into the world Tyrone had so casually opened up? By morning, Malik knew that he couldn't ignore it any longer. The offer had already taken root in his mind, like a seed planted too deep to be pulled out. He went looking for Tyrone, finding him leaning against a faded brick wall on 14th Street, talking to a group of older men. When Malik approached, Tyrone broke away from the conversation and gave him a knowing look, as though he had expected Malik to return. "You ready?" Tyrone asked, his voice low, steady. Malik hesitated only for a moment. "Yeah. I'm ready." And just like that, Malik's life began to change. The first few weeks were a blur. Tyrone took him under his wing, showing him the ins and outs of the game with the kind of patient focus that Malik admired. There was no rush, no grandiose initiation into the world. Instead, it was a slow, methodical process, learning who to trust, who to avoid, and how to read the subtle signs that told you everything you needed to know about a situation. Malik found himself growing more comfortable with the unspoken rules of the game. He learned how to handle money, how to make deals, and most importantly, how to stay unnoticed. The key to survival on these streets wasn't about being the loudest or the toughest, it was about being invisible when you needed to be, and yet standing firm when the time came to act. It was around this time that Malik first began to notice the weight of the choices he was making. As he walked the streets, running errands for Tyrone, delivering packages, and watching the flow of business, something inside him began to shift. He wasn't just a bystander anymore. He was part of the world now, a small cog in a machine that ran on power, fear, and money. But Malik also understood that the machine was fragile. One wrong move, one moment of weakness, and it could all come crashing down. He could see the tension in the eyes of the older men, the way they held themselves, always alert, always calculating. They had all learned the hard way that there was no such thing as a permanent position in this world. The streets didn't offer loyalty, they offered only survival. There were moments when Malik questioned whether he had made the right choice. Late at night, after he'd finished his work, he would return to his small apartment, lie down in his bed, and think about what he had left behind. His mother, the life he had once dreamed of having, a life free from the chaos of the streets. But then, he would think about the money, the power that seemed just within reach. He would think about how the people on his block now looked at him with a kind of respect, even fear, in their eyes. And in those moments, Malik would find himself torn between two worlds, the world he had known, and the one he had entered. It was a delicate balance. The more he learned, the more he realized how easy it would be to slip deeper into the underworld. Every step forward seemed to pull him further in, and he knew that if he wasn't careful, there would be no way out. But for now, he walked the line, a quiet observer in a world that demanded silence and loyalty. He wasn't in too deep yet, but he was learning quickly. And as he did, he could feel the tension building, because every choice he made now would determine how far he could go, and how far he was willing to fall. Malik Redd wasn't yet Stoneheart, but with every passing day, he was becoming something much closer to it. The deeper Malik got into the game, the more he understood that survival was not just about strength, it was about perception. He learned quickly that the streets, for all their rawness, had an elegance to them. They were a delicate balance of power, trust, and betrayal, all interwoven in ways that only those with real eyes for the game could see. What appeared to be chaos to the untrained eye was, in fact, a system. A carefully orchestrated dance of players moving in and out of shadow. Malik became a part of that dance, learning its steps, even as he kept his distance. His role was simple at first: watch, listen, and learn. Tyrone gave him the smaller jobs, moving weight from one corner to another, keeping an eye out for law enforcement, making sure the money was clean. He was a messenger, an errand boy. But Malik didn't mind. The work didn't require much, and in a way, it suited his temperament. He didn't need to be in the spotlight, he didn't need to make noise. He understood early on that the most dangerous men were the ones who never drew attention to themselves, the ones who kept their emotions hidden beneath layers of calm and control. Malik could do that easily. He never flinched, never raised his voice, never let anyone see the thoughts behind his steady gaze. He was becoming the kind of man who could slip through the cracks of the world, unnoticed, a shadow within the shadow. Still, there were moments when the weight of the choices he was making pressed down on him. It wasn't the physical toll of the work, but the mental and emotional strain. The constant second-guessing. The small voice in his head that told him this was a road he might never come back from. And yet, it was hard to deny the rewards. He saw the way people treated him differently now. He was no longer just the quiet kid from the block. He had a name now. He was respected, even feared. Money came easier. He had more than enough to take care of himself and his mother. The world that had once seemed so distant, so unreachable, was now within his grasp. And with each new job, each new connection, he felt himself rising, inch by inch, within the ranks of the underworld. But every rise has its challenges. Malik began to see the cracks in the facade, the dangerous undercurrents that were always present in a world built on greed and fear. Tyrone, for all his calm exterior, was not immune to the pressures of the streets. He was careful, strategic, but even he had enemies. Malik noticed it first in the way Tyrone's demeanor shifted during their late-night meetings. There was a tension in his voice, a subtle unease in his eyes. Tyrone was used to being the one in control, the one who held the cards, but Malik could sense that something was shifting beneath the surface. Tyrone was no longer as untouchable as he had once seemed. And then there were the whispers, always just outside of earshot, floating through the crowd. Rumors of betrayal, of deals gone wrong, of loyalties shifting. Malik knew better than to believe everything he heard, but it was hard to ignore the signs. He saw it in the faces of the older men when they spoke of Tyrone's operations. There was a wariness there, a hesitation in their words. The wheels of the game were always turning, but sometimes they turned in ways you couldn't predict. And that, Malik realized, was the danger of living this life. You never truly knew who your allies were. People wore masks in this world, and sometimes the person who seemed most loyal was the one who would betray you first. It wasn't long before Malik began to see the cracks in his own role. He had never thought of himself as a key player, never sought power or recognition, but as he moved through the ranks, something shifted. He had built relationships, earned trust, and seen just enough of the inner workings of the game to know how it could all fall apart in an instant. He realized that the path he was walking wasn't just about making money or earning respect, it was about surviving the game itself. The deeper you went, the more fragile your position became. Everyone had a price, and in a world like this, everyone had a weakness. Malik's first real test came one evening when a deal went sideways. It was supposed to be simple: drop off a package, exchange it for cash, and leave. But somewhere along the way, things went wrong. Malik was already halfway to the drop-off point when he saw the flash of headlights behind him, the unmistakable sound of a car slowing down, its engine idling as it drew nearer. His instincts kicked in immediately. He knew something wasn't right. The car pulled up alongside him, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to move in slow motion. A man in the passenger seat glanced at him, just a second too long, and Malik knew instantly that the situation had changed. "Yo, you got what we asked for?" The voice was deep, cold, a tone that didn't invite questions. Malik said nothing at first. He knew better than to speak first. He kept his head down, eyes scanning the surroundings, searching for any sign of danger. There was something in the air, something that felt off. He took a step back, eyes flicking to the alley behind him, to the street ahead. Then, without warning, the man in the car reached for something under his jacket. Malik's heart rate spiked. He didn't flinch, didn't run. Instead, he reached into his own jacket, pulling out the package, holding it out in a way that kept his body between the men and the alley. He knew that if he made any sudden moves, it would be over. He'd seen enough of these moments to know how they played out. And he wasn't going to let it happen to him. "What's the problem?" Malik asked, keeping his voice even, his gaze steady. The man didn't respond at first. He studied Malik for a long moment, his eyes scanning him like a predator sizing up prey. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the tension broke. The man withdrew his hand, sat back in the car, and nodded. "You're good," the man said. "Just a little nervous, is all." Malik said nothing. He handed over the package and stepped back. The car sped off into the night without another word. Malik exhaled slowly, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. He had come too close. Too close to losing everything. It was moments like these that taught you the true cost of living this life. That night, as Malik walked back to his apartment, he couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. He had made it through this time, but how many more times could he dodge danger? The streets were unforgiving, and every move he made now carried weight. He wasn't just playing a game anymore, he was in the heart of it. And he had to decide how far he was willing to go before the game claimed him. The incident with the car that night wasn't just a close call, it was a warning. A reminder that the game Malik had stepped into wasn't as simple as making a few moves and taking home a profit. There were forces at work that had nothing to do with respect or loyalty, only survival. And Malik understood now more than ever that the game had its own rules, unwritten, but no less rigid. Tyrone had given him the tools to survive, but Malik was starting to realize that survival wasn't enough. He needed to start thinking beyond the immediate hustle. He needed to understand the bigger picture, or he'd become just another casualty of the streets. For a while, Malik kept his head low, focused on the tasks at hand. He ran the errands, made the deliveries, kept the streets quiet, and observed. He learned even more about the delicate dance of power in the underworld. It was about controlling information, knowing who had the leverage, and understanding the subtle shifts in alliances that could make or break you. Malik had always been a patient observer, but now that patience had evolved into something else, a kind of quiet ambition. He wasn't just content being the guy who did the work anymore. He was becoming the guy who asked the questions, the guy who could see the moves before they were made. Tyrone, for all his experience, wasn't perfect. Malik noticed his slip-ups, the way he would underestimate people, the small but crucial mistakes he would make when his focus wavered. He was good, but he wasn't infallible. And Malik was beginning to see that if he ever wanted to step into a bigger role, he would have to learn from those mistakes, not just follow in Tyrone's shadow. One day, as Malik was handling a delivery in the early afternoon, he found himself face to face with something he hadn't expected, an opportunity. He had been running a package from one of Tyrone's suppliers in the next block when he spotted something unusual. A group of men gathered in the corner, speaking in hushed tones, exchanging looks that were far more serious than they needed to be. Malik knew them. They were small-time dealers, players in the game but not real threats. But something was different this time. They were on edge, their movements sharp, as though something larger was at play. Malik's gut instinct told him to keep moving, to avoid drawing attention. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this was the moment. The moment when everything could change. He slowed his pace, giving them a wide berth, but not before overhearing snippets of their conversation. The words were jumbled, disconnected, but they painted a clear picture. Someone had crossed someone else, a betrayal, maybe even a setup, and the word on the street was that there was going to be retaliation. Malik's ears perked up. Retaliation was a delicate thing. It wasn't something that happened in the open. It was always calculated, a series of carefully orchestrated moves that had to be executed just right. He couldn't make sense of everything they were saying, but he knew one thing: whoever was behind the retaliation wasn't just looking for revenge. They were making a play for control. Malik couldn't help but feel a spark of curiosity. He wasn't ready to act, not yet, but his mind was already working, analyzing the pieces. He turned back and walked the long way home, replaying the conversation in his head, piecing together what he could. The street was full of whispers, of rumors, of shifts in power, but this felt different. This felt like a tipping point. He didn't go straight to Tyrone. It wasn't that he didn't trust him, it was that he couldn't afford to show his cards just yet. This was something Malik had to think through carefully. If he went to Tyrone with this information, it might be dismissed as just another street rumor. But if Malik could prove it, if he could find the key piece of the puzzle, then he might have something that could change the game. For the next few days, Malik kept his eyes and ears open, watching, waiting. He didn't make any rash moves. Instead, he went about his usual tasks, but now with a heightened awareness. The people he interacted with, their words, their body language, the way they shifted when he asked the right questions, everything mattered now. He watched how the lower-level dealers acted, how the corners shifted, how everyone seemed just a little more jittery. There was something big in motion, and Malik was starting to understand it. He could feel the tension in the air, like a storm cloud gathering over the city. It was a storm that was about to break, and Malik needed to be ready. The breakthrough came when one of the smaller players, Carlos, a street hustler Malik had known for years, approached him. Carlos wasn't someone who usually dealt in information. He was a bottom-tier guy, a runner, but his face was tense when he stepped up to Malik one evening. "Hey, Malik," Carlos said, glancing around nervously. "You heard about what's going on? Big things happening, man. I'm not supposed to say anything, but it's coming down. You better watch your back." Malik's heart skipped a beat. He had been expecting something like this, but hearing it from Carlos made it real. He leaned in closer, keeping his voice low. "What's coming down?" Malik asked, his tone calm, betraying none of the curiosity he felt. Carlos looked over his shoulder, ensuring no one was listening before speaking in hushed tones. "Word on the street is, Tyrone's operation's gonna get hit. It's all set up. There's a new crew looking to take over, and they don't care who they have to step on to get there. Tyrone's not the only one making moves. People are looking to make a play, and they're going for the top." Malik's mind raced. This was it. The game was about to change, and he was standing at the crossroads. If he played his cards right, he could be the one making the next move, not just reacting to the one coming his way. But that meant stepping up, taking risks, and aligning himself with the right people. It also meant stepping away from Tyrone, at least in the sense that Tyrone would see. "Who's behind it?" Malik asked, his voice steady. Carlos hesitated. "Can't say. But I'll tell you this much, they're not local. They've got connections. And they're moving fast. They won't wait around." That night, Malik sat in his apartment, staring out of the window at the darkened streets below. He was no longer just an observer, no longer just a quiet player in the background. He was in it now, right in the thick of the most dangerous game he'd ever played. The decision he made in the next few days could mean everything: his survival, his rise, or his downfall. The game was changing. The storm was coming, and Malik had a choice: he could wait for it to pass, or he could step into it, with everything he had. And he knew that if he didn't make his move now, the streets would move on without him. Malik's mind churned with the weight of what he had learned over the past few days. Carlos's warning had been more than just idle gossip, it was a signal, a bell ringing in the distance, marking the beginning of a new chapter. The underworld, for all its secrecy, had its rhythm, its patterns, and Malik was beginning to see them more clearly. He could feel the currents beneath the surface, a rising tension that no one was acknowledging openly, but that everyone knew was there. Tyrone's empire wasn't as secure as it seemed, and the world around it was shifting in ways Malik hadn't anticipated. But how deep did this threat go? How many layers of betrayal were hiding in the shadows? Malik had learned one fundamental truth on the streets: nothing was ever as it seemed. What appeared to be a straightforward power play could turn into a maze of allegiances, all shifting beneath the surface. He had seen men betray their closest allies over petty slights, watched entire crews turn on each other over misunderstandings or greed. There was no honor in this game, only survival, and even that was fleeting. The more Malik thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about Tyrone losing control of his empire. This was about the larger battle for power, one that had been quietly brewing for months. The new crew Carlos had mentioned, the one looking to take over, wasn't just after Tyrone's territory. They were looking to disrupt the entire structure, to shake things up so thoroughly that no one would be left standing in the same place they had been before. And that, Malik knew, was the kind of change that could make or break a person. Malik wasn't afraid of change, but he was careful with it. In the streets, you didn't make a move without considering the consequences. Each decision could set off a chain of events that spiraled far beyond your control. And yet, as much as Malik tried to stay detached, he could feel the pull. The desire to be more than just a foot soldier in Tyrone's empire. The urge to rise, to take the reins, to make his own name in a world that had been built on the names of men like Tyrone, men who were no longer as invincible as they once seemed. It was one thing to play the game from the sidelines, but it was another to step into the center of the chaos. Malik could feel that he was on the cusp of something bigger, something that could either lead him to unimaginable power or pull him under, consumed by the very forces he sought to control. He wasn't sure if he was ready for it, but he knew he couldn't ignore it anymore. If he was going to survive, he had to act. The game was changing, and Malik needed to be a part of that change. The first step came in the form of a meeting with one of Tyrone's old associates, a man named Vincent. Vincent was an enigma, quiet, calculating, and always one step ahead of everyone else. He had been with Tyrone since the early days, but over the past few months, he had started pulling back from the day-to-day operations. Malik wasn't sure where Vincent's loyalty lay, but he knew that a man like him wasn't someone you ignored. They met at a small diner on the outskirts of the city, a neutral ground where no one would be watching too closely. The air inside was thick with the smell of coffee and greasy food, and the hum of quiet conversation filled the background. Malik sat at a booth near the back, his eyes scanning the room while he waited for Vincent. When the man finally walked in, it was as though the entire energy of the room shifted. Vincent was a man who carried himself with a quiet authority, his every movement deliberate, measured. "You've been keeping busy," Malik said, his voice steady but with a note of curiosity. He wasn't sure why Vincent had agreed to meet him, but he knew it wasn't for no reason. "I've been watching," Vincent replied, his eyes scanning the room just as Malik had done. "And I've been hearing things. Word on the street is, there's a shift coming. Tyrone's not the only one with eyes on the prize." Malik leaned in, feeling the weight of the conversation settle between them. He had already heard about the new crew making a play, but hearing it from Vincent was different. There was a sharpness in his tone, a sense of certainty that made the situation feel far more dangerous. "Who's making a play?" Malik asked, his mind already racing through possibilities. "Carlos said something about a new crew." "Is it them?" Vincent shook his head. "It's bigger than that. There's a power struggle happening beneath the surface. Tyrone's empire isn't just being targeted by outsiders, it's being undermined from within." Malik felt his pulse quicken. What Vincent was suggesting was worse than he'd imagined. If Tyrone was being targeted from all sides, it wasn't just about losing a few shipments or making a bad deal. This was about the entire foundation crumbling, about everyone fighting to claim a piece of what was left when the dust settled. "I'm not saying you're wrong, but how do you know that?" Malik asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't sure if he could trust everything Vincent was saying, but it was hard to ignore the man's reputation. "I've been keeping tabs," Vincent said cryptically. "You know how it is. If you listen closely enough, you can hear the whispers. People get restless when things aren't going the way they expect." Malik sat back in the booth, processing what Vincent had said. If what he was hearing was true, then things were moving faster than he'd thought. Tyrone might have been able to keep his enemies at bay before, but now, the game had changed. People who had once been loyal were starting to look elsewhere. Some were already making moves to align themselves with the new crew, while others were simply trying to carve out their own space in the chaos. Vincent's next words cut through Malik's thoughts. "If you want to survive this, you're going to have to make your move soon. There's no more time to sit back and wait. If you stay in Tyrone's shadow, you'll be buried with him when it all falls apart." Malik felt a chill run down his spine. He knew what Vincent was saying was true, but it wasn't an easy decision. The loyalty he had to Tyrone wasn't something he took lightly. But loyalty, he realized, wasn't always enough to keep you alive in this world. Loyalty was a tool, a currency that people used when it was convenient, and discarded when it was no longer beneficial. "I'm listening," Malik said quietly, his gaze steady. Vincent leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You've got potential, Malik. But you need to start thinking bigger. The city's changing, and you need to decide where you want to stand when the dust settles." Malik didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He knew what he had to do. The time for playing it safe was over. He had a choice to make, and he couldn't afford to wait any longer. The game had already started. Now it was up to him to decide how he was going to play it. The following days passed like a blur. Malik's mind was restless, constantly replaying the conversation with Vincent. There was no denying the truth of what he had said. Tyrone's reign was weakening, and those who had once been loyal to him were now looking for ways to profit from the chaos. For the first time, Malik started to consider the possibility that the world he had known, his entire sense of belonging in the streets, was crumbling. But rather than fear, he felt a strange sense of calm. The pieces were falling into place, and for better or worse, it was time to make a decision. He knew what needed to be done. Vincent had shown him the path, but it was up to Malik to walk it. To do so, however, meant walking away from the comfort of what he had always known. No longer could he afford to be a mere foot soldier, running errands and staying out of the spotlight. If he was to step into the void left by Tyrone's weakening power, he had to be strategic, calculated. Malik wasn't just aiming to survive, he was aiming to take control, to become a force in his own right. In the days that followed, Malik took more time than usual to observe the world around him. He paid close attention to Tyrone's closest allies, watching for cracks in their once unshakable loyalty. He observed the new crew that had started making waves on the streets. They were slick, smart, and aggressive, everything Tyrone had once been, but sharper, more modern. This new crew was run by a man named Adrian Ace Cortez, a former hustler who had climbed his way to the top by working with anyone who could advance his agenda. He wasn't from New York originally, but he had quickly become one of the most influential players in the underworld. Ace had a reputation for being ruthless and calculating, but also for knowing exactly when to strike. He was the kind of man who didn't leave anything to chance. And it was obvious he was setting his sights on Tyrone. But while Ace and his crew posed an immediate threat, they weren't the only players Malik needed to think about. The streets were always filled with hidden players, those who moved in the shadows, too quiet and too careful to draw attention, but just as dangerous as any overt gangster. Malik understood that. It was this undercurrent, these quiet alliances and backroom deals, that often decided the fate of the city. He had been a part of this network for years, and now he needed to leverage everything he had learned. As the days went on, Malik started to build his own network. He began speaking to people who had once been loyal to Tyrone but were now starting to question his leadership. Malik was careful. He didn't make his intentions clear right away. He didn't want to be seen as someone trying to take Tyrone's place, at least not yet. Instead, he positioned himself as an ally, someone who could offer protection, stability in a world that was becoming increasingly unpredictable. People were hungry for power, and Malik knew just how to feed that hunger. One of the first people he spoke to was Tommy, a mid-level player who had been with Tyrone since the beginning. Tommy had always been one of those guys who worked in the shadows, handling things behind the scenes. He wasn't flashy, but he had connections everywhere. He knew who was moving what, who was selling what, and who was talking behind closed doors. Tommy was someone Malik needed on his side if he was going to move forward. So, Malik made sure to visit him one night after a long day of watching the streets. They met at a small dive bar, tucked away on the edge of the neighborhood. The kind of place where people didn't ask questions and you could talk freely without fear of being overheard. Tommy was already seated in a corner booth when Malik walked in. He looked up, his face expressionless, but his eyes held a spark of recognition. He knew why Malik was here. "You're thinking about the future, huh?" Tommy said, his voice low but direct. Malik didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slid into the booth across from Tommy and took a moment to gauge the situation. Tommy had always been one of the more cautious guys in the game, never one to make rash decisions. If Malik was going to get anything useful out of him, he needed to tread carefully. "Things are shifting, Tommy," Malik finally said, his voice steady. "People are starting to look elsewhere. Tyrone's losing control, and the new crew is making a move. You see it too, don't you?" Tommy looked at him for a long moment, his fingers tapping lightly on the rim of his glass. Finally, he spoke, but there was a hesitation in his voice. "I see it. Everyone's talking about it. But you've got to be careful, Malik. The streets, they don't forget loyalty, even when the game changes." Malik nodded, understanding the sentiment. Loyalty was a powerful thing, but so was power. And in this world, power was always the driving force. "I'm not saying we should abandon Tyrone," Malik said, carefully choosing his words. "But we can't just sit here and wait for things to fall apart either. We need to prepare. We need to make sure we're not left out when the dust settles." Tommy's gaze softened slightly, but he remained guarded. "And what exactly do you have in mind?" Malik leaned forward, lowering his voice. "We start laying the groundwork. We build our own alliances, start positioning ourselves for what's coming. If we move smart, we can control the flow, control the territory. We don't need to be the loudest voice. We just need to be the one who's still standing when the dust clears." Tommy stared at him for a long time, the weight of the conversation sinking in. "You really think we can pull it off, he asked quietly. Malik gave a slight nod. We can. But we can't wait around. We need to act before Ace and the others make their move. It's time to start thinking bigger. There was a long silence as Tommy processed what Malik had said. Finally, he let out a quiet sigh. All right, he said, finally breaking his silence. I'm in. But you better be sure about this. Once we start making moves, there's no going back. Malik's eyes locked onto his. I'm sure. It's now or never. In the days that followed, Malik and Tommy worked quietly but quickly. They reached out to old contacts, people who had been loyal to Tyrone in the past, and began to test the waters. The reactions were mixed. Some people were hesitant, unsure about whether they should throw their lot in with Malik. Others were already looking for a way out of Tyrone's crumbling empire, and they were eager to make an alliance. Malik was careful to move slowly, building his influence without drawing attention to himself. He didn't want to make any rash decisions. Each move had to be calculated, and he knew that if he wasn't careful, one wrong step could bring everything crashing down. But with every conversation, every deal made in the shadows, Malik could feel himself gaining more control. He was no longer just following Tyrone's orders. He was shaping his own future. It wasn't long before Malik realized that things were moving faster than he had expected. The streets were buzzing with whispers of a new power on the rise, and Malik's name was starting to circulate. He had made the right choice. The pieces were falling into place, and for the first time, Malik felt the pull of destiny. The days that followed were a blur of activity. Malik's every step was measured, every word spoken calculated. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes, not now. The power vacuum in Tyrone's empire was growing, and the new crew, led by Adrian "Ace" Cortez, was tightening its grip on the streets. Malik could feel the pressure building, not just from external forces, but from within the ranks of Tyrone's loyalists as well. There was a sense of unease in the air, a collective awareness that the status quo was no longer sustainable. But despite the chaos swirling around him, Malik remained calm, composed. He had always been good at playing the long game, and now it was time to show just how far his patience could take him. One of the first things Malik did after securing Tommy's tentative loyalty was to begin speaking to other influential figures within Tyrone's circle. He knew that power didn't just come from controlling territory or making deals, it came from understanding the men and women who held sway over the streets. Malik wasn't the kind of guy to trust easily, but he also knew that if he wanted to rise, he had to gather people around him who shared his vision. He couldn't do it alone. One of these people was Maria, a sharp-witted woman who had been handling Tyrone's business dealings with several of the city's largest suppliers. Maria had always been someone Malik respected. She was efficient, intelligent, and had a keen sense for the pulse of the market. She wasn't the type to get involved in the street-level violence, but her influence in the financial side of the operation was undeniable. If Malik was going to take control of Tyrone's empire, he needed her on his side. They met in a quiet cafe, a place where Maria was known to frequent for meetings with her contacts. She sat at a corner table, a cup of coffee in front of her, her eyes scanning the room. Malik slid into the seat across from her, offering a nod of acknowledgement. Maria didn't return the nod immediately, but she did give him a once-over, assessing him with the same meticulous attention to detail that she applied to every situation. "You look like you've been busy," Maria said, her voice low but confident. "What's going on, Malik?" Malik didn't waste any time. He had learned long ago that getting straight to the point was the best way to ensure a productive conversation. The game's changing. Tyrone's losing control, and the streets are starting to shift. People are looking for stability, and I can offer that. I know you're loyal to him, but if you want to stay ahead of the curve, you're going to need to start thinking about your next move. Maria's expression remained neutral, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, curiosity, maybe. Or perhaps caution. She had always been a careful player, and Malik knew that she would take her time before making any decisions. You think you're the one to offer stability? She asked, her tone skeptical. You know as well as I do that the game's never stable. It's a house of cards. One wrong move, and everything falls. Malik leaned in slightly, his eyes locking with hers. The game doesn't have to be chaotic. It doesn't have to be a house of cards. But you need the right people in place. People who know how to move when the time comes. People who can build something that lasts. Maria studied him for a long moment, the silence hanging between them. Finally, she spoke. You've got ambition, Malik. I'll give you that. But you can't do this alone. You're going to need more than just a few contacts to make a real play. Malik nodded. He knew she was right. Ambition alone wouldn't be enough. He would need a team, a group of individuals who were as committed to the vision of the future as he was. And Maria, despite her reluctance, could be a valuable asset in that future. She knew how the financial side of the operation worked, and her connections were second to none. If he could win her over, he would have a key player in his corner. I'm not looking to do this alone, Malik said, his voice steady. But I need people who are ready to think beyond just survival. I'm not interested in a temporary power grab. I want something that lasts. I want something that will change the game. Maria's gaze softened slightly. You'll need more than just ambition to pull that off. You're going to need trust. And trust is hard to come by in this world. Malik smiled, but there was no humor in it. I know. But trust comes with respect, and respect comes with power. If I can prove that I can deliver, the rest will follow. Maria considered this for a moment before taking a sip of her coffee. I'll think about it, she said finally. But I'm not making any promises. The streets are changing fast, and everyone's looking for a way to stay on top. You'd better be sure you can handle the weight of that kind of responsibility. Malik didn't say anything at first. He knew that this was a delicate dance, and pushing too hard would only push her away. Instead, he gave her a simple nod. I'll prove it, he said quietly. Give me time, and I'll prove it. As the days turned into weeks, Malik continued to work behind the scenes, consolidating power and building alliances. But things were becoming more complicated. Adrian Ace Cortez and his crew weren't the only ones making moves. The streets were filled with rumors, whispers of new alliances, betrayals, and shifting loyalties. There was a tension in the air, a feeling that something was about to snap. Malik knew he had to move quickly. He couldn't afford to sit back and wait any longer. Tyrone's weakness was becoming too obvious, and the more time Malik spent in the background, the more opportunities Ace and others had to consolidate their own power. The clock was ticking, and Malik knew that every day he hesitated was a day he lost in this game of survival. He couldn't let the chaos overwhelm him. He had to be precise, calculating. Every move needed to be measured, every conversation weighed for what it could bring him. He had to stay ahead of the curve, and he had to keep his eyes open. The moment he allowed himself to get distracted was the moment someone else would take the advantage. Malik's mind was a constant whirl of calculations. He knew that he had a limited window to make his move, and every decision he made had to be calculated to perfection. But there was one thing he hadn't accounted for, his growing sense of paranoia. He had always been a cautious man, but now, it was different. He could feel eyes on him everywhere he went. He could feel the weight of the streets pressing down on him, the whispers growing louder, the tension rising. Every conversation, every meeting, every handshake carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken threats. He could sense that the balance of power in the city was fragile, and the smallest misstep could send everything crashing down. But Malik wasn't afraid. He knew that in this world, survival was about more than just strength. It was about control, and control was something he was starting to understand more than ever before. As the sun began to set on another long day, Malik knew that the time had come. The street was ready for a change, and he was going to be the one to make it happen. The streets were alive with whispers, but Malik knew that noise could be both dangerous and useful. The more the rumors circulated, the closer his plan came to reality. He was no longer just playing in the shadows, now, his name was part of the conversation. The air was thick with uncertainty, and Malik knew that in this world, uncertainty was as dangerous as it was powerful. He was positioning himself at the center of it all, waiting for the perfect moment to act, to take what was rightfully his. Malik had always been the type to observe first, to let the dust settle before making his move. The thing about power was that it wasn't always about brute force, it was about timing, patience, and understanding when to strike. His move would be one of precision, not panic. Every player on the board, from Ace Cortez to the low-level hustlers, was moving with their own intentions, but Malik had a plan that would make them all converge at the right moment. The chaos in Tyrone's empire was the perfect storm he needed to capitalize on. He had already started making alliances, but there was one player left to secure. Carlos, the King Moretti, the seasoned veteran who had been a trusted advisor to Tyrone, was a man of great influence. Carlos wasn't the type to show his cards quickly, but Malik knew that he had a window of opportunity. Carlos was older now, and though his reputation still carried weight, the streets had begun to question whether he still had the fire to lead. He had been a part of Tyrone's inner circle for years, but Malik knew that even Carlos could be swayed if the right approach was taken. Malik had never been the kind of person to flatter or beg. He was direct, and he understood that respect had to be earned, not given. But he also knew how to appeal to the right ego at the right time. Carlos had seen it all, done it all, but he had always been a man of pride. Pride was his weakness, and Malik intended to exploit it. They met at an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a place where the air was thick with the scent of metal and dust, a remnant of the industrial days long gone. Carlos had insisted on the location, and Malik had agreed without hesitation. It wasn't the kind of place where anyone would expect a meeting of great significance, but that's exactly what made it perfect. The atmosphere was quiet, almost desolate, and in a way, that mirrored the moment between them. They weren't in the middle of a bustling city or under the glaring lights of a popular club, no, they were in a forgotten corner of the world. The perfect place for a conversation that could change everything. Malik stepped inside, his boots echoing on the cold concrete floor. Carlos was already waiting, seated at an old metal table with a glass of whiskey in front of him. His weathered face, lined with years of experience, softened slightly when he saw Malik. They had crossed paths before, but this was different. This wasn't a chance encounter, this was a conversation that could alter the course of their lives. "You're a brave man, Malik," Carlos said, his voice deep but measured. "Coming here like this, no backup, no entourage. I respect that." Malik didn't sit immediately. He stood, his posture relaxed but his mind sharp. "I didn't come for respect," he replied, his tone calm but firm. "I came because we both know where this is going. Tyrone's time is running out. You know that. I know that. The streets know that. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Carlos studied him for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. There was a flicker of something, interest, curiosity, perhaps even recognition of the weight in Malik's words. Carlos had seen many young men come and go, each thinking they could be the one to take over, each failing for one reason or another. But Malik was different. He had the kind of presence that made Carlos pause, even after all these years. He wasn't just another hungry kid looking for a spot at the table. Malik was calculating, focused, and he had a fire that Carlos could respect. "What makes you think you're ready to take over?" Carlos asked, his voice tinged with challenge. "The streets don't just hand power to anyone. It's a game of survival. And survival takes more than just ambition." Malik met his gaze with steady confidence. Survival isn't just about staying alive, it's about staying relevant. Staying ahead. The streets are changing, Carlos. The old ways aren't enough anymore. Tyrone's system, it's outdated. You know it. I know it. If you're going to keep your position, you need to adapt. You need to get ahead of this storm. I'm offering you a place at the table when it all comes crashing down. Carlos leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on the table, fingers tapping lightly against the wood. His eyes never left Malik, and for a moment, the silence between them stretched out, heavy with the weight of the decision Carlos was facing. He had always been a man who valued loyalty, but there was something about Malik's words that struck a chord. Carlos had always considered himself a kingmaker, but could Malik be the one to rise above the rest? You think you can control all of this, huh? Carlos finally asked, a half-smile playing at the corner of his lips. You think you can control the streets? Malik didn't flinch. I don't just think I can control it. I know I can. But I need the right people with me. People who know the game, people who understand how the city works. That's where you come in. Carlos chuckled softly, a sound that held more cynicism than humor. You've got a lot of guts, Malik. I'll give you that. But it's not about guts. It's about knowing when to strike and when to lay low. It's about playing the long game. And that's why I came to you, Malik said, his voice low but unwavering. Because you know the game. You know how to survive, how to thrive. But I also know you're tired of playing second fiddle. You've been standing behind Tyrone for too long. The question is, how much longer are you willing to let him drag you down? Carlos' gaze shifted slightly, the faintest hint of discomfort flickering across his face. It was small, almost imperceptible, but Malik saw it. He knew he had struck a nerve. You're right, Carlos said after a long pause, his voice softer now, as if the weight of the years had finally caught up with him. I've been waiting for my turn. Waiting for the right moment. Maybe that moment is now. Malik didn't smile, but there was a satisfaction in his eyes. This was what he had been waiting for. Carlos Moretti, the man who had been a key figure in Tyrone's empire, was now considering making his move. Malik could see the internal struggle in Carlos's eyes. The loyalty to Tyrone, the years of serving him, and the ambition to be something more. But Malik was offering something bigger than just power. He was offering a future. A chance to build something that would stand the test of time. I'm not asking you to turn on him, Carlos, Malik said. I'm asking you to look at the bigger picture. Tyrone's time is done. But we don't have to be done with him. We can take what we need, build something stronger. Together. Carlos sat there for a moment, his eyes distant as he considered Malik's words. It was clear that Malik had planted the seed. The rest would be up to Carlos. But for the first time in a long while, Carlos wasn't looking at the situation with doubt. He was looking at it with opportunity. You've got guts, Malik, Carlos said, his voice low but tinged with respect. All right. I'm in. Malik didn't show any outward sign of satisfaction, but inside, he knew that this was a turning point. With Carlos on his side, he now had a powerful ally who could help solidify his grip on the streets. But this was just one piece of the puzzle. Malik knew that the real battle was just beginning, and the true test of his control would come when it was time to move against Tyrone. For now, though, Malik had won a critical victory. And in this game, every victory counted. The clock was ticking, and the game was only just beginning. The city was starting to feel different, its pulse becoming erratic, like the beat of a drum slowing down just before the final crash. Malik could sense it more and more, a tension in the air that was almost palpable, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to give. Tyrone's grip on the city had been slipping for months, but now it seemed inevitable. His old crew was falling apart, disjointed and frayed, while new, hungry players like Ace Cortez were making their moves, capitalizing on the instability. Malik could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. His move had to be flawless. If it wasn't, he knew the city wouldn't just reject him, it would crush him. The meeting with Carlos had been a breakthrough, but it wasn't enough. Malik had learned long ago that power wasn't about making one successful move, it was about making the right moves in the right order. It was a game of patience, precision, and perception. Now that he had Carlos Moretti in his corner, the next step was to solidify his standing among the rest of Tyrone's old associates. He couldn't afford to be just another man trying to take over. He needed to be the man who had already taken over, even if no one else saw it yet. His influence had to be felt in the undercurrents of every conversation, in the decisions made in every back room, in the movements on every street corner. If the city was going to bend to him, it needed to feel like it was already his. His first task after Carlos was simple: reach out to the ones who had always been just beneath the surface, the ones who were loyal to Tyrone, but had never had the power to make a real impact. Malik knew that it was the forgotten players, the ones who weren't in the spotlight but held power in their own right, who could be the most dangerous. If he could bring them into the fold, he would have a network that could not be easily challenged. The first person on his list was Benny, the Bear, Russo, a stocky, barrel-chested enforcer who had spent years as Tyrone's right-hand man on the streets. Benny had never been a mastermind. He wasn't a strategist or a negotiator. He was a man of action, and action was something he did well. But in this game, Malik knew that sometimes the men of action were the ones who carried the most weight. Without men like Benny, the real power wasn't in the hands of the brains, it was in the hands of those who could make things happen with force and fear. Benny had a reputation for being as brutal as he was loyal. His hands were as large as his temper, and his ability to intimidate was rivaled only by his willingness to throw down when necessary. But despite his strength, Benny had always been just a tool, a loyal tool, but a tool nonetheless. Malik wasn't interested in using him. He needed Benny to see beyond that. He needed Benny to become something more than just muscle. Malik found Benny in a grimy dive bar near the docks, a place where the shadows were thick and the air always seemed heavy with the scent of stale beer and desperation. Benny sat alone in the back corner, a half-empty glass in front of him. He looked up as Malik approached, his eyes narrowing slightly. Benny wasn't a man who trusted easily, and Malik knew that. But trust wasn't the goal here, understanding was. Understanding that Malik wasn't just another ambitious upstart. Malik was someone who understood the game, and Benny could see that, even if he wasn't ready to admit it. "You've got some nerve showing up here," Benny said, his voice gravelly, like he'd been smoking for years. He didn't offer Malik a seat, but Malik took one anyway, sliding into the chair across from him without a word. "I don't come for nerves," Malik replied, his voice low, but firm. "I come for results. And right now, Tyrone's got no results. He's too weak. The streets are changing, Benny, and the old ways aren't going to cut it anymore." Benny chuckled darkly, taking a slow sip from his glass. "You think I don't know that? You think I'm some idiot who hasn't seen the writing on the wall?" His eyes flicked around the room, as if looking for something. "But it's one thing to see the change coming, and another to be the one who's ready to step up and take it." Malik leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on Benny. "That's exactly why I'm here. You and I both know that Tyrone's days are numbered. He can't keep control of this city, not with all the chaos going on. But we can. You don't have to stay in his shadow anymore. You don't have to be just the muscle. You can be something more." Benny stared at him, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched out, thick and uncomfortable. Malik didn't break eye contact, allowing Benny to process his words. He could see the wheels turning in Benny's mind, the flicker of uncertainty behind the tough exterior. Benny had always been loyal to Tyrone, but that loyalty was starting to feel like a burden, not a badge of honor. Malik could see it, even if Benny wouldn't admit it just yet. "All right," Benny said after a long pause, his voice low, almost reluctant. "I'll bite. What's your plan?" Malik's eyes hardened, a cold determination in his gaze. "We take control. Together. But this time, we do it right. No more letting things slide, no more waiting for the scraps. We set the terms, and we make sure everyone knows it. If we do this right, we won't just take what's ours, we'll build something new. Something stronger. Benny studied him for a moment, his face unreadable. Then, with a grunt, he pushed his glass aside and stood up. All right, Malik. I'm in. But don't think for a second that I'll be your second in command. I'm not some lackey you can push around. You got that? Malik nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. I wouldn't dream of it. You'll be by my side. And when this is all over, we'll be the ones in charge. Together. The deal was made. Benny was on board, and that was a huge win for Malik. But he knew that Benny was just one piece of the puzzle. To take down Tyrone's empire and rebuild something new, he needed more. He needed the loyalty of the men who had been operating on the fringes, the ones who were waiting for their moment to rise. As Malik left the bar, he couldn't shake the feeling that the winds were shifting, that he was on the edge of something much bigger. But he also knew that in this world, things weren't ever truly stable. There would be more challenges, more obstacles. Ace Cortez wasn't going to roll over. And Tyrone's loyalists weren't just going to give up their power without a fight. But Malik had a plan, and he was starting to gather the right people. And as the city continued to stir with anticipation, Malik knew that his time was almost here. Malik's rise was not without its challenges, nor was it without its subtle dangers. The streets buzzed with rumors and uncertainty, and the game he was playing, one of calculated moves and shrewd alliances, was becoming a delicate balance. Every step he took, every deal he made, brought him closer to the inevitable confrontation with Tyrone. It wasn't a matter of if, but when. And Malik knew that timing was everything. The bigger the empire, the harder the fall. By now, Malik had gathered a small, loyal group around him, but the real work was yet to come. The next step in his plan was to secure his control over the key territories in the city. This was no small task. The city was a patchwork of fiefdoms, each ruled by different factions, each with its own codes, alliances, and bitter rivalries. Malik knew that the longer he waited, the more these factions would close ranks against him. If he was going to take over, it had to be swift and decisive. The first territory he needed to secure was the heart of Tyrone's drug trade. The neighborhood of Eastgate was the lifeblood of Tyrone's empire, a gritty, industrial area, where the scent of cheap cigars and burning rubber hung in the air. The streets were ruled by small-time dealers, mid-level bosses, and a handful of hardened enforcers who had been loyal to Tyrone for years. But loyalty had a shelf life, and Malik could see the cracks in the foundation of Tyrone's empire. Malik's contacts in Eastgate told him that the streets were restless. Tyrone's hold on the area was weakening, and many of his lieutenants were looking for an exit strategy, eager to capitalize on the uncertainty. This was the perfect moment for Malik to make his move. He started by approaching a few key players in the area, men who controlled the flow of information, the ones who had their fingers on the pulse of the streets. Malik wasn't the type to rush in with guns blazing. He knew better than that. He understood that respect had to be earned, and sometimes, the best way to gain respect was by offering something of value. But he also knew that time was of the essence. He couldn't afford to let things drag on too long. One of the men Malik needed to approach was Eddie, the fixer, Garcia, a man known for his ability to smooth over problems and make them disappear. Eddie wasn't a fighter, he wasn't someone who would ever take a life with his own hands, but he had an uncanny knack for making people do what they didn't want to do. He was the kind of guy you called when things needed to be arranged, when negotiations had to happen behind closed doors. Eddie had connections with some of the higher-ups in the drug trade, and Malik knew that if he could get Eddie on his side, the rest of the pieces would fall into place. Eddie wasn't easy to find. He didn't hang out in the usual spots, didn't visit the usual bars or clubs. Malik's people had to dig deep, following every rumor and whisper, until finally, they found him, a nondescript building on the edge of Eastgate, where Eddie had set up shop as a business consultant. It was a front, of course. Behind the veneer of legitimacy, Eddie was still very much a part of the underworld. When Malik arrived, Eddie was already waiting for him, sitting behind a desk cluttered with paperwork. The room smelled faintly of tobacco and coffee, and the walls were lined with old photographs of the neighborhood, relics from a time when things were simpler, or at least, seemed to be. Eddie's expression was calm, guarded, and as Malik entered, he gestured to a chair across from him. "Malik," Eddie said, his voice smooth but with an underlying tension. "I've been hearing things. You're making moves. I've got to say, I'm impressed. But I'm not sure if I'm buying what you're selling just yet." Malik took a seat, his posture relaxed but purposeful. "I'm not asking you to buy anything, Eddie," he said. "I'm offering you an opportunity. You know the situation with Tyrone. You see the cracks in the wall. The question is, do you want to be on the inside of what's coming, or do you want to watch from the outside as things fall apart?" Eddie leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk. He wasn't in a hurry to respond, his mind clearly weighing the situation. It was clear to Malik that Eddie wasn't the type to be easily swayed. He had seen too much and heard too much to take any offer at face value. But that was exactly why Malik liked him. He didn't want people who were easily impressed. He wanted people who could see the bigger picture, people who could think ahead. "I'm listening," Eddie said, finally breaking the silence. Malik nodded. "Tyrone is finished. You know it. I know it. Hell, the whole city knows it. The question is, what happens next? Do you want to be stuck under a man who's lost his grip, or do you want to be part of something bigger? Something that's actually going to last?" Eddie didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied Malik for a long moment, his gaze measuring, calculating. He knew the game, he wasn't the kind of person to rush into anything, especially not something this high stakes. But Malik was making an offer that he couldn't ignore. "You've got a lot of nerve, Malik," Eddie said finally. "But I've got to give you credit, you know how to play this game. So, what exactly are you proposing?" Malik didn't hesitate. "I'm proposing that we take control of Eastgate. Tyrone's not going to be able to hold on to it much longer. We can make the transition smooth, keep things quiet. You'll have your connections, your territory, but you'll be on the winning side. And I'll make sure you're taken care of. No more playing second fiddle." Eddie thought it over, his eyes narrowing as he processed the offer. Malik could see the gears turning in his head, and he knew that Eddie's answer wouldn't come right away. But Malik wasn't worried. He'd said enough to plant the seed. After what seemed like an eternity, Eddie finally spoke. "All right, Malik. You've got my attention. I'll help you with Eastgate, but don't forget, you're not the only one who's got people in this city. There are other players. People who'll be watching, waiting. You're gonna need more than just a few pieces to win this game." Malik smiled, his eyes sharp and calculating. "I know, Eddie. I've got a plan for them too. But right now, Eastgate is the key. Once we've got it, the rest will follow." With that, the deal was struck. Eddie was officially on board, and Malik's position in the city was becoming more solidified with each passing day. But as Malik left Eddie's office, he knew that this was just the beginning. There were still bigger obstacles ahead, and the most dangerous ones were the ones who would never see him coming. The key to his success would be in the small, quiet moves, building alliances, gaining trust, and never showing his full hand until the time was right. The city was shifting, and Malik was determined to be the one who controlled its next chapter. Every move mattered. Every choice had consequences. But for the first time in his life, Malik truly believed that the streets were his for the taking. And he wasn't about to let anyone stand in his way. The next phase of Malik's plan was crucial, solidifying his control over the rest of Tyrone's empire. With Eastgate now secured through Eddie, Malik had made a significant inroad, but there was still a long road ahead. Tyrone's influence stretched far and wide, touching nearly every corner of the city. Malik knew that to topple him, he needed to peel away at the edges first, isolating him from his allies before making the final move. In the weeks following his deal with Eddie, Malik had been quietly working the streets, getting a sense of where the true power lay. He had learned quickly that Eastgate was just a piece of the puzzle. The real challenge was in the West End, an affluent but corrupt area that Tyrone controlled through a mix of legitimate businesses and illicit activity. The West End was home to the city's elite, politicians, businessmen, and crooked cops, who all had their hands in Tyrone's pockets. It was a stronghold, and Malik knew that if he could get a foothold there, it would shake Tyrone's entire operation. The first step was to deal with the West End's local kingpin, Victor Vince Moreno. Vince wasn't just a street boss, he was a well-connected power player with influence that reached all the way to City Hall. A former member of the police force, Vince had a reputation for both ruthlessness and cunning. He had used his connections to secure legitimate businesses, giving him a veneer of respectability that was hard to pierce. But Malik wasn't deterred. He had seen men like Vince before, men who thought they were untouchable simply because they were above the law. And Malik knew that if he wanted to reshape this city, men like Vince were a necessary obstacle to remove. Vince's main operations ran out of a high-end nightclub in the West End, a place called the Velvet Room. The club was a hotspot for the city's rich and powerful, where deals were made over champagne and the night stretched into the early hours. But it was also a front for Vince's drug trade, money laundering, and other illicit activities. It was where the deals that kept Tyrone's empire alive were made, where power was brokered behind closed doors. It was the perfect place for Malik to begin his maneuvering. Malik's first move was to get close to Vince. To do that, he needed to enter the circles Vince moved in, to mingle with the elite of the West End, and make himself a name. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, but he had one thing Vince didn't, a fresh face, free from the baggage of old rivalries and entanglements. The people who ruled the West End thought they were beyond the reach of men like Malik, young, hungry, and determined. They underestimated how far someone with ambition could go. Malik didn't just want to confront Vince, he wanted to outmaneuver him. It would be a slow burn, a process of sowing seeds of doubt and mistrust. He started by quietly working with a few lower-level players in the West End, men who had always been on the fringes of Vince's operations. These were the men who moved the product, the ones who cleaned the money. They weren't the top dogs, but they held enough influence to create cracks in Vince's foundation. Malik knew he needed to make them feel like they had a choice, a way to rise up, a way to escape the shadow of Vince's control. It wasn't long before Malik's name began to circulate. The whispers were subtle at first, but they grew louder. In the tight-knit world of organized crime, reputation was everything. Malik wasn't just some ambitious young thug, he was a man with a plan, a man who knew how to play the game. And the game, in Malik's mind, was about understanding people. Vince's underlings were loyal, yes, but loyalty could be bought. And Malik had a knack for giving people what they needed, whether it was power, money, or protection. A few weeks later, Malik arranged to meet one of Vince's most trusted lieutenants, a man named Raymond Ray Russo. Ray was known for being Vince's right-hand man, the one who ran the operations that kept the money flowing. If anyone could lead Malik to Vince, it was him. The meeting was set in a quiet diner on the outskirts of town, a place where deals were made without the flash and attention of a club or high-end restaurant. It was the perfect place for Malik to establish himself as a player, while also gauging Ray's trustworthiness. When Ray walked in, Malik knew instantly that this would not be a quick conversation. Ray was a big man, broad-shouldered and with the kind of quiet intensity that came from years of surviving in the streets. His eyes were cold, calculating. He wasn't someone who trusted easily, especially not when it came to outsiders trying to make a name for themselves. "You got 5 minutes, Malik," Ray said as he slid into the booth across from him, his voice low and direct. "I don't like to waste time." Malik smiled, his demeanor calm, measured. "Good. Neither do I." He leaned in slightly, his voice soft but full of intent. You're in a good position, Ray. You've got Vince's ear, and that means you've got power. But power's a funny thing. It doesn't last forever. People get tired of the same old thing. They start to look for a change. You ever thought about that? Ray's gaze hardened, and for a moment, Malik thought he might snap. But instead, Ray just sat back, his expression unreadable. You're a bold one, Malik. I'll give you that. But I don't play these games. You're trying to take down Vince, you better be sure you've got something better to offer. Malik nodded slowly, letting the words settle. I'm not trying to take down Vince. I'm trying to build something. And I'm offering you a seat at the table. Not as a lackey, not as someone who takes orders, but as someone who makes the decisions. Ray didn't respond immediately, but Malik could tell he was intrigued. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Finally, Ray spoke. All right, Malik. Let's say I'm listening. What exactly are you offering? Malik leaned in a little further, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm offering you a chance to be on the right side of history. Tyrone's done. Vince is a sinking ship. But I'm not asking you to jump on board with just anyone. I'm offering you a seat at the table, next to me. When I take over, it's not just about power. It's about control. And we'll both have it. Ray studied him for a long time, his eyes narrowing as he weighed the proposition. Malik could feel the tension in the air, he could feel the decision hanging just out of reach, the tipping point coming closer with every word. But Ray was smart. He wouldn't make a move unless he was absolutely certain. Finally, Ray let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. You've got guts, Malik. I'll give you that. You make a hell of an offer. Let's see if you can back it up. It was a small victory for Malik, but a crucial one. Ray wasn't fully on his side yet, but Malik knew that he had made the first step toward drawing Vince's lieutenant into his fold. One by one, the pieces were falling into place. Slowly, quietly, Malik was weaving a network of influence that would soon surround Vince and force him to either join him or fall. And Malik wasn't planning on waiting around for Vince to make his move. He would be the one in control, the one holding the cards when it all came to a head. As Malik left the diner, a sense of quiet satisfaction settled over him. The city was changing, and with every conversation, with every step he took, Malik could feel the walls of Tyrone's empire beginning to crack. He wasn't just an up-and-comer anymore, he was a force to be reckoned with. And the West End was just the beginning. The final steps of Malik's plan had begun to take shape. The city, once a labyrinth of loyalties, alliances, and old money, now seemed like an open map to him, each territory, each figure, each move moving toward his ultimate goal. The West End was slipping further from Vince's grasp, and the whispers on the street had turned into rumors that Tyrone was no longer in control of his own empire. But Malik wasn't a man who rushed. He knew that building trust was just as crucial as building power. The key to it all lay in patience, and Malik was learning how to wield it like a weapon. Ray Russo, the lieutenants, and the small-time hustlers who had come under Malik's wing were now beginning to see the writing on the wall. What had started as a mere flicker of ambition in Malik had now turned into a palpable shift in the city's criminal ecosystem. No longer were his moves merely ambitious, they were calculated, methodical. He was no longer a young man trying to make a name for himself. Malik had become a brand, a symbol of strength and intelligence in a world that had long been ruled by brute force and intimidation. Yet, it wasn't just about power for Malik, it was about legacy. Every person he touched, every corner of the city he began to control, was one more step toward becoming the figurehead of a new order. The type of order that others could only dream of but never attain. His reputation was now synonymous with success, not by chance but by design. And as his network grew, so did the challenges. Tyrone's resistance was still very much alive, though in its last throes. What had been an indomitable empire was now a ticking clock. By now, Malik had gathered a significant number of men who trusted him. They weren't just loyal, they were invested in his vision. This new era he spoke of wasn't just a lofty ideal, it was something tangible. Something real. But as Malik took steps closer to taking down Vince and Tyrone, the challenges of consolidating power began to surface. The first problem was internal. With power came jealousy, and with jealousy came betrayal. Malik had no illusions about loyalty in his world, he understood its fickleness. The men who had started with him weren't the same ones who would stay with him to the end. Greed, self-preservation, and ambition were powerful forces. To solidify his position, Malik had to ensure that he removed those who might weaken his network from the inside. That meant making some hard decisions. One man who had caught Malik's attention was Carlos Chico Hernandez, a low-level enforcer who had quickly risen in Malik's ranks. At first, Carlos had shown potential, brutal when needed but loyal to a fault. But as Malik's empire grew, Carlos began to show cracks in his character. He started to act more independently, making moves that didn't have Malik's approval. His ambition started to surpass his position, and that made Malik uneasy. Malik didn't show his hand too quickly. He played the long game, letting Carlos dig himself deeper. He observed his every move, waiting for the right moment to strike. But even in the midst of this internal turmoil, Malik kept his focus on his larger goal, bringing down Vince and Tyrone. The time had come to weaken Tyrone's stronghold further, to ensure his grip on the West End would be unchallenged. Vince, meanwhile, had started to panic. His own power was slipping through his fingers. The whispers of Malik's influence had turned into a cacophony of gossip in the underworld, and it wasn't long before Vince took notice. His meetings with his lieutenants became more frequent, more frantic. The walls were closing in, and Vince was running out of options. His desperation made him dangerous, his unpredictability was what made him such a formidable opponent. But Malik was no stranger to danger. He knew that to deal with someone like Vince, he couldn't just go in with brute force. That wouldn't work. Vince had too many connections, too many people in his pocket. Malik needed to make him feel the pressure, make him think that all was lost before closing in for the final blow. That meant creating a strategy that would isolate Vince from his allies and cut him off from his resources. The key to Vince's downfall, Malik realized, was his own network of corrupt politicians, businessmen, and cops. They were the linchpins that kept Vince's operations alive, providing him with the protection he needed to stay above the law. Without them, Vince's empire would crumble. And Malik wasn't about to let him keep those connections. Malik started working on undermining Vince's support. It was a slow, methodical process. He first targeted the businesses that Vince controlled in the West End. With subtlety and patience, Malik began to plant seeds of doubt among the owners, turning them against Vince. He did it quietly, getting to know their weaknesses, offering them better terms, and making it clear that their future lay with him, not Vince. Malik didn't need to break them all at once. A few key defections would be enough to shift the balance of power. But Vince's political ties were a harder nut to crack. Those men weren't easily swayed by promises of a better life. They had their own interests, and those interests were firmly tied to Vince's empire. So, Malik turned to his most trusted asset, Eddie, the fixer, Garcia. Eddie was an expert in manipulating people, he understood how to play the political game. With Eddie's help, Malik started to apply pressure on Vince's allies in the government. Bribery, blackmail, and a few carefully timed rumors were enough to make even the most steadfast politician reconsider their loyalties. As Vince's allies started to question their ties to him, Malik's influence grew. The West End was becoming his playground, and Vince, once a towering figure, was now a man on the edge of a cliff. Malik could feel the pieces coming together. It was only a matter of time before he would take over the entire region. But despite all his success, Malik couldn't afford to lose sight of the bigger picture. He wasn't just trying to take down Vince or Tyrone, he was setting the stage for something even grander. The city was full of untapped opportunities, and Malik knew that he had the skill and foresight to take advantage of them. But before he could think about the future, he needed to finish what he had started. Vince had to fall. Tyrone had to be dethroned. And Malik, once and for all, would rise as the undisputed king of the city. But as Malik worked in the shadows, weaving his plans tighter and tighter, the question lingered: who could be trusted, and who was simply playing their own game? In this world of deception, even the most loyal could be tempted by power. Would Malik be able to keep his empire intact, or would he fall victim to the same fate that claimed so many before him? The next steps in his journey would determine his future, whether he would rise to the top, or become just another name on the list of fallen kings. As Malik tightened his grip on the city, his path to power became increasingly treacherous. Every move he made seemed to stir the pot, and as his influence spread, so did the dangers. Those who had once been his allies began to grow anxious. The same ambition that had drawn them to him now served as a source of unease. Power, Malik had come to understand, was as much about control as it was about perception. And the perception of a man in power could shift like a shadow, depending on who was casting it. Vince, despite the cracks in his empire, had begun to adapt. The pressure Malik had put on him was working, but Vince's ability to survive wasn't to be underestimated. He'd spent years building a network of loyalists, each one trained in the art of survival. And now, as his position grew more precarious, Vince was prepared to fight back. He wasn't just going to let Malik walk in and take what was his. No, Vince was a man of resilience, and he had one last play to make. Malik knew that Vince's final move would be nothing short of desperate, and that made him even more dangerous. Vince was not a man accustomed to losing, and that meant he would do anything to maintain his position. As his empire started to crumble, Vince's temper flared. His meetings with his lieutenants became more frequent, more tense, and Malik knew the time was coming when Vince would make his final stand. The question was, would Malik be ready? Behind the scenes, Malik was aware of every move Vince made. His spies had become more active, his network of informants more sophisticated. There was no corner of the city that Vince could retreat to that Malik wouldn't know about. But even the most well-laid plans had their flaws, and Malik was about to discover just how vulnerable he was. One night, as Malik was going over his plans in the dim light of his office, Eddie Garcia entered, his face unreadable. Eddie had always been a steady hand, a man who could keep his cool under pressure. But tonight, there was something different in his demeanor. "Malik, there's a situation," Eddie began, his voice low. "Vince isn't just sitting back anymore. He's making moves." Malik leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "What kind of moves?" "There's word he's forming an alliance," Eddie said, his tone tense. "He's trying to pull together all the smaller players in the city, gangs, crooked cops, politicians. If he can get them on his side, he might be able to turn this thing around. And if that happens, it's going to be a hell of a fight." Malik felt a chill settle in his chest. Vince had always been a master of manipulating people, but this was different. This wasn't just about power, it was about survival. Vince wasn't simply trying to maintain his position, he was trying to make a last-ditch attempt to resurrect his crumbling empire. Malik stood up, his mind racing. He'd always known Vince was dangerous, but this was a different level of danger. If Vince could pull this off, he might be able to rally enough support to make a run at Malik's territory. And Malik couldn't afford to let that happen. Not now, not when everything was so close. "We can't let him do this," Malik said, his voice low but firm. "We need to disrupt this alliance before it even has a chance to form." Eddie nodded. "I've already got a few things in motion. I've got some people looking into the smaller players Vince is trying to pull in. But we'll need to move fast." Malik knew Eddie was right. They didn't have time to waste. Every moment spent waiting gave Vince more time to solidify his position. Malik had to act, and he had to act quickly. But even as he formulated his next move, he felt a gnawing sense of unease. This wasn't going to be easy. Vince was cornered, and cornered men were often the most dangerous. Over the next few days, Malik's operation moved into overdrive. He sent his men to shadow Vince's known associates, keeping a close eye on every meeting, every phone call. The network of spies Malik had built was tight, and information began to flow in faster than ever. With each piece of intel, Malik saw Vince's plans for what they were: a desperate grab at power, a final attempt to hold on to something he knew was slipping through his fingers. But as Malik's men gathered information, a new complication arose. Carlos Chico Hernandez, once one of Malik's most trusted enforcers, had begun to act out of line. His behavior had grown erratic, and Malik had received reports that Chico had been meeting with men from Vince's camp. The whispers on the street had started, and it seemed that Chico was considering jumping ship. The timing couldn't have been worse. If Chico went over to Vince, it would be a major blow to Malik's operation. Carlos was well-liked, respected, and had the ear of many of the lower-tier men who had helped build Malik's empire. Losing him would create a rift that Malik couldn't afford. Malik didn't hesitate. He called for a meeting with Chico. The two had been through a lot together, and Malik had always considered him a valuable asset. But the trust between them was now strained, and Malik could feel the tension in the air as he prepared to confront Chico. They met in a quiet, unassuming bar on the outskirts of the city. Malik kept his demeanor calm, but his eyes were sharp. When Chico arrived, he didn't look like his usual confident self. There was an edge to him, something uncertain, something that Malik hadn't seen before. "Chico," Malik said, his voice steady, "we need to talk." Chico took a seat across from him, his gaze wary. "I don't know what you're talking about, Malik. I'm loyal to you." Malik didn't smile. "Loyalty's a funny thing, Chico. It can turn on you when you least expect it." There was a long silence between them. Chico shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers tapping the edge of the table. He finally looked Malik in the eye, his voice low. "I'm not the one who's losing control here. Vince is still a player. And if I'm being honest, I don't know if I can keep riding with you if things keep going the way they are." Malik's gaze hardened. He had known this day was coming. "So, you're saying you're ready to switch sides? Just like that?" Chico hesitated, but then nodded slowly. "I need to secure my future, Malik. If you can't give me that, then I'll find someone who will." Malik's thoughts were racing, but his expression remained impassive. This was a test, and he wasn't about to let Chico see how much it bothered him. He leaned back in his chair, eyes never leaving Chico's face. "Let me make this clear," Malik said, his tone cold. "You don't have a future with Vince. And if you walk away from me now, there's no coming back." Chico's face twitched, and for a moment, it seemed like he might back down. But the look in his eyes told a different story. The seed of doubt had been planted, and now Malik had to push it deeper. "Think carefully, Chico," Malik said softly. "You're either with me, or you're against me. There's no middle ground in this game." The silence between them stretched, thick with tension. Finally, Chico broke it with a sigh. "I'm with you, Malik. For now." Malik smiled, the tension easing slightly, though he knew better than to trust Chico fully. But for now, the danger had been averted. His attention, however, quickly turned back to Vince. Chico's wavering loyalty was just another piece of the puzzle. As Malik tightened the noose around Vince, he knew there was one last step to take. Vince was going to make his final stand, and Malik would be ready for it. The war was almost over, but the hardest part was yet to come. Would Malik emerge victorious, or would he be consumed by the very ambition that had driven him to this point? Only time would tell. Malik Redd's life behind bars was not the quiet retreat many might imagine for a man who had once ruled the streets with an iron fist. Instead, It was a chapter that only deepened the myth surrounding his name, a period of reflection, isolation, and occasional battles with his own inner demons. The confines of the prison walls did not shield him from the chaos of his past life, nor did they offer a place of solace. It was here, in the stark isolation of his cell, that Malik was forced to confront the consequences of the life he had lived. For someone like Malik, whose power had come from fear and intimidation, the prison system was a new type of battlefield. Here, there were no gleaming suits, no underworld meetings, no fast cars or thick stacks of cash. There was only time to think, to remember, to regret. The men he had once controlled, those who had feared him, were now behind bars alongside him, and though the same rules did not apply, there was still an unspoken code in prison. Respect was earned, but it could just as easily be taken away. In the first few months, Malik kept to himself. The brutality of his reputation had preceded him, and in the beginning, no one dared approach him. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the truth of his loneliness began to set in. The prison walls, once a symbol of his captivity, began to feel more like a tomb. Malik had spent his life building a wall of stone around his emotions, a facade of cold indifference that had made him invincible on the streets. But here, in the quiet of his cell, those walls began to crumble. For the first time in years, he was no longer the feared enforcer of the capital, he was simply a man, left to grapple with the ruins of his own choices. At night, the thoughts would come rushing in, a flood of memories from the days when he was at the height of his power. He could almost hear the distant echoes of his old life, the sound of doors slamming shut on deals, the laughter of his associates, the whispered conversations that had marked his rise to prominence. But these memories were tinged with regret. The faces of those he had betrayed, those who had trusted him, haunted him in his dreams. He had once been a man who feared nothing, but now, in the silence of his cell, he feared everything. The fear of time, of losing what little was left of his identity, was more overwhelming than any danger he had faced in the streets. Prison became a strange kind of purgatory for Malik. The guards, who once served as his silent protectors in the outside world, now watched him with cold indifference. The respect he had commanded was no longer part of the equation, he was just another prisoner. The other inmates, too, seemed to view him differently. Some saw him as a legend, a relic of a past era, others, more cynical, looked at him as just another criminal, no different from the others they had encountered over the years. Malik was neither a king nor a pawn in this world, he was an outsider. Yet, amidst the coldness of prison life, a strange sense of clarity began to form. Malik had always prided himself on his ability to control his emotions, to keep his feelings in check and never let anyone see his vulnerabilities. But in prison, that mask began to slip. There were moments when the years of violence, betrayal, and bloodshed weighed heavily on his soul, and Malik would lie awake, staring at the cracked ceiling of his cell, wondering if it had all been worth it. He had once believed that power could shield him from the consequences of his actions. But now, power felt like an illusion, a fleeting, fragile thing that had vanished the moment he was taken away from the streets he had once ruled. In his solitude, Malik began to take stock of the life he had led. The violence, the constant need to assert dominance, the endless cycle of crime and punishment, was it all worth it? He had achieved the very thing he had always wanted, respect, fear, and power. But now, in the quiet of prison, those things seemed hollow. What good was power if it didn't bring peace? What was respect if it was built on fear? These questions gnawed at him, but there were no answers. Not yet. Some nights, the regrets were so intense that Malik would pace in his cell, running his hands through his hair as though trying to escape the grip of his own thoughts. He had always been the one to dish out the pain, to enforce loyalty with violence and intimidation. But now, in the stillness of his prison, he felt the weight of every action he had ever taken. The faces of the people he had wronged flashed before him, the families torn apart by his decisions, the innocent lives affected by his criminal dealings. It was a cruel irony that, in the end, it was the consequences of his actions that he could no longer outrun. Despite the weight of regret, Malik never fully lost his edge. He remained cold, calculating, and strategic, traits that had served him well in his criminal career. But prison had forced him to face the reality that his life had been a series of compromises. In the world he had inhabited, loyalty was bought with blood, and enemies were dealt with swiftly and without hesitation. Yet, in prison, loyalty was an empty word. He realized that in his quest for power, he had alienated everyone who had once been close to him. His loyalty had always been to himself and to the brutal world he had created. But now, in the quiet cells of the penitentiary, he understood that true loyalty had never been a part of his life at all. Malik's time in prison was not one of complete reflection, it was a mix of forced introspection and the constant battle to maintain his sense of self. His reputation had once been everything, but now it felt like a ghost, a shadow of a life he could never return to. The world outside had moved on, and Malik was left to wonder whether anyone still remembered the capital enforcer who had once feared nothing. But perhaps the most profound realization came to him during his long, solitary nights. Power and fear were fleeting. The one thing that remained constant, no matter where you were or what you had done, was time. Time, Malik realized, was his true enemy. It was the one thing he could never control, the one thing that had slipped through his fingers like sand. And as the days turned into months, and the months into years, Malik Redd was left to confront not just the brutal reality of his actions, but the passage of time itself. In the end, prison became more than just a punishment, it became a mirror. A mirror that reflected back the truth about the man Malik Redd had been, and the man he had become. The aftermath of Malik Redd's fall spread through Washington like a slow, rumbling shockwave, silent yet undeniable. When the city learned that the man known as Stoneheart had finally been taken down, the reaction was not one of surprise but of quiet recalibration. Power, in the underworld, never simply disappeared, it shifted, searched for a new home, and reshaped itself in unexpected ways. Malik's arrest created a vacuum, and in the wake of his downfall, every person connected to him felt the pull of that emptiness. Those who had once stood closest to Malik reacted first. His inner circle, men who had built reputations beside him and benefited from his ruthless enforcement, suddenly found themselves stripped of protection. While Malik had been a shield, an immovable force who handled threats before they grew teeth, his absence left them exposed. Some tried to hold their positions, believing that loyalty to Stoneheart still carried weight, but within weeks, they discovered the harsh truth: Malik's name no longer commanded fear. It evoked opportunity. Everyone who had once feared Malik now saw a chance to settle old scores or move in on territories once tightly controlled. A handful of his closest associates fled the city altogether. They had risen under the shadow of his power, and without him, they knew they were nothing more than targets. Some escaped to other states, hiding in small towns, changing names, attempting to disappear into ordinary life. But the past has a habit of following those who try to outrun it. Rumors surfaced of 2 former lieutenants found dead within months of the trial, each murder marked with the quiet efficiency of men who had waited years for revenge. Others, however, embraced the chaos. Younger, hungrier faces began pushing to fill the void Malik left behind. They lacked his discipline, his understanding of the delicate balance between fear and control, and their reckless grabs for power only deepened the instability across the city. Shootings increased, alliances dissolved as quickly as they were formed. Where Malik had been cold, measured, and calculating, the new generation was impulsive, driven by ego rather than strategy. The underworld he once kept in a tight grip fractured into smaller factions, each desperate to claim what was left of his legacy. But Malik's fall didn't just shake the criminal side of the city, it sent ripples through the personal lives of those connected to him. People he had touched, helped, or hurt found themselves forced to confront the version of him they had known. His family, who had once kept a careful distance from his criminal dealings, could no longer avoid the spotlight. Reporters camped outside their homes, digging for any fragment of his past. Some family members shut themselves away, avoiding contact with the outside world, while others tried to salvage what pieces of normalcy they could. They received letters from strangers, some filled with sympathy, others with anger. To the public, they were the remnants of a monster. To those who had known Malik in quieter moments, they were simply people caught in the undertow of his life. Even those who had admired Malik from afar felt the shift. There were men in the city who had considered him a necessary evil, someone who kept order where the law could not. Some still spoke his name with a kind of reluctant respect, acknowledging that crime had grown more chaotic without him. Others reflected on the harm he had caused and quietly felt relief that his reign had ended. In each corner of Washington, whether in whispered conversations or unspoken thoughts, Malik's downfall became a reference point for change. Law enforcement, too, was forced to grapple with the aftermath. For years, Malik had been the shadow they couldn't outrun, a ghost at the center of a network too intricate to easily dismantle. His arrest opened the door to new investigations, new leads, and the unraveling of crimes long buried. Yet, in the months that followed, some officers found themselves unexpectedly frustrated. Malik had been the linchpin, the one who held so many criminal threads together. Without him, those threads scattered, making the web harder to understand and even harder to dismantle. His removal helped, yes, but it also exposed a deeper truth: crime did not vanish with one man's fall. It simply rearranged itself. There were people Malik had helped, too, quietly, discreetly, without ever revealing the softer impulses he kept hidden from the world. These were individuals on the fringes, families he had protected from rival crews, neighbors who had benefited from his unspoken rules, workers he had ensured were left unharmed during territorial disputes. For them, the aftermath was complicated. They knew Malik's darkness, but they also knew his strange, sometimes contradictory moments of mercy. They struggled to make sense of the man who had terrified so many and yet, in rare instances, had shown glimpses of humanity. In the neighborhoods Malik once patrolled, stories began to circulate, half-truths, memories mixed with myth. Children whispered that they had seen him before his arrest, towering like a ghost in the dim streetlights. Older residents told tales of the night he stood between their families and danger. Some shared stories of violence, others spoke of protection. Over time, these stories became part of a collective memory, not entirely accurate, but powerful in shaping how the community remembered him. Yet, perhaps the most profound aftermath belonged to those who had once stood against him. Rival gang members felt a sense of vindication, a release of long-held tension. For years, they had shaved their operations around Malik's shadow, careful not to provoke him. Now, with him gone, they moved freely. But with that freedom came new dangers. Alliances formed against common threats now dissolved, and old rivalries resurfaced with new intensity. Malik had been a wall, terrifying, oppressive, but undeniably stabilizing. Without him, chaos rushed in. The city, as a whole, felt different after Malik's fall. Not safer, not more dangerous, just changed. Something in its heartbeat shifted, like a rhythm suddenly out of sync. Malik Redd's legacy, much like his life, was a tangled web of myth and reality. After his downfall, stories of his ruthlessness, his fearlessness, and his cold demeanor spread far and wide, transcending the prison walls that held him. To some, he became a symbol of the heights one could reach through sheer power and violence. To others, he was a cautionary tale, a reminder of the eventual price that must be paid for a life lived on the edge. The truth, however, lay somewhere in between the legends and the harsh facts of his actions. His story, like that of many criminals before him, was warped by those who told it. Over time, Stoneheart became something more than just a man. He became a figure of myth, a ghost that haunted the dark corners of Washington's criminal world long after he was gone. Some whispered that his spirit still lingered in the alleyways and under the city's quiet streets, a reminder of the power he once wielded. And though he was behind bars or out of sight, his name lived on, forever etched in the underworld lore of Washington D.C. Malik Redd's legacy, though fractured by his downfall, remained a potent part of Washington D.C.'s criminal lore. The myth of Stoneheart lived on in whispers, passed from one generation of criminals to the next. The streets, now quieter without his presence, still held the echoes of his reign. His story became a cautionary tale, about the cost of ambition, the fragility of power, and the inevitability of time's passage. Some saw him as a tragic figure, a man undone by his own ruthlessness, while others remembered him as a force of nature, unstoppable until the very end. Despite his fall, his name carried weight, reminding the world that in the criminal underworld, even legends could be both feared and forgotten. Malik Redd's life, despite all its violence and betrayal, offers a profound lesson about the fleeting nature of power and the ultimate cost of loyalty. Through his rise and fall, one truth remains clear: the decisions we make shape not just our future, but the lives of everyone around us. In his quest for control and respect, Malik learned too late that these things are often built on fragile foundations: fear, manipulation, and the crushing weight of a life lived in the shadows. His story serves as a cautionary tale, reminding us that no amount of power can shield us from the consequences of our choices. Malik Redd's legacy is a complex one, shaped by both his rise to power and his eventual fall. Though his life was filled with violence and betrayal, there are lessons to be learned from his story. The quest for power, respect, and loyalty, when built on fear and manipulation, leads only to emptiness. His time in prison became a final chapter of self-reflection, where he faced the consequences of his actions. In the end, Malik's life serves as a reminder that no matter how high one climbs, the weight of the past can never truly be outrun.